Our featured guest tonight is a fantastic new author. She's here to talk about her debut thriller novel, Keeper, which is already making waves in the literary world. Please welcome to the show, Jessica Moor. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your debut novel is out, and it's on its way to a wonderful paperback release. What does it feel like to be at this point?
Well, it's interesting because I've got nothing to compare it to, but obviously releasing a novel in lockdown is very different to releasing a novel in normal times. You don't do any events in person, and I was actually in quarantine the day that my book first came out, so I couldn't go and see it in shops. But having worked on the story for, well, it was 4 years now that I started the book, 4 years ago that I started the book. So to finally have that out there in the world and have people responding to it and getting in touch to tell me their thoughts and sometimes quite personal, emotional stories has been wonderful, if a little bit surreal.
I know for a lot of writers, it's a real lifelong fight to get where you are now. Does it feel kind of like a culmination of a dream finally coming true?
Yes, I mean, I think I first announced that I wanted to be a writer when I was 4 years old. So as long as I've been sort of aware of myself as a person, I've always wanted to be a writer. But then it's interesting because you think that once there's a physical book that you can hold in your hand, then you will feel somehow different and you remain the same sort of unfortunate person. But yes, it's interesting because you now have to think, well, what am I going to do next now that the thing that I thought I would spend my whole life trying to do has been achieved? So I need to, I guess, write another one.
Before we get into the book, let's talk about you a little bit. What was life like growing up for you?
I'm from London. I had a very sort of normal, slightly bookwormish childhood. Always sort of watching people trying to get a sense of who they were, which I think was just my sort of shyness and trying to figure out how to incorporate myself into other kids playing, but I think then served me well as a writer. So yes, I went to school. I went to an all-girls school, which is an interesting experience and I think informs the book in some ways. And then I went off and studied at university and then worked in the violence against women and girls sector, which had a focus on domestic violence. And that was really the thing that I wasn't working in the sector thinking I better write a book about this. I think that if you go about any job that way, then you don't sort of throw yourself into it. But it was a question of looking at the system and understanding how things really worked, as maybe I might have assumed they worked or might want them to work. And that made me feel very angry. And as I sort of stepped away from that and decided to focus more on the writing, there was only one thing that I really could have written about.
So is that how writing came into your story?
Well, I've always written. As a child, I wrote a lot about sort of cats getting stuck up in trees. But I think I'm naturally a debater. I'm somebody who gets very impassioned by issues. And I think that the way that I make sense of those issues and try and see them from all sides and try and understand how they're a product of humanity is to explore them through novels, because I think what fiction can do is put us in someone else's shoes. We have to empathize. And so that's the wonderful thing about a novel, is that you have to empathize with everyone, and not just the people that might seem easy to empathize with. You've got to put yourself in everyone's shoes. So for me, that was the way that I kind of filtered my experiences and came to understand them and was able to kind of settle the anger inside me into something that was a bit more possible to live with and possible to turn into action.
At what point did you decide that you could do writing full time? Was that like in university?
I don't know if I ever decided that, because I think that one of the adages that I grew up with was that if you want to be a writer, you'll end up living in a cardboard box. So I didn't think that was ever going to be possible, but at the same time, it was the only thing I ever wanted to do. So I thought maybe I could do writing in a sort of more indirect way. I could maybe be a copywriter, or when I was in the domestic violence sector, I was actually putting together grant proposals. I was trying to get money, so I was writing, but it wasn't the same as the kind of writing that I wanted to do. And then when I'd written Keeper, I was lucky enough that I was able to go full time with that. And quite honestly, I can't imagine myself doing anything else.
What was the first book that truly moved you?
That's a very good question. The first book that I ever read by myself was a book called Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. I don't know if he's very popular in the States, but he's a very famous children's author in the UK. And it's about a fox who's being hunted by a pair of evil farmers. No, 3 evil farmers. And it was the first book that I ever read by myself, and I think I was 5. And I took it home, and I can remember sitting on the sofa. I can remember the light in the room. I remember everything about it, and I remember just being fully transported for the first time in my life. And just being sucked into this book and then emerging for air 3 hours later, whatever it was. And I think that sense of being moved by this story and the characters really taught me what books can do. And I think that a lot of the books that I love the most are the books that I read as a child. And I often think that what I'm trying to do as an adult is recapture that page-turning thing, that totally immersive thing that is maybe easier when you're a child, and we sometimes lose as we grow up.
It's interesting. It's easier, but yet these days for a lot of children, it's not, because so many people they're into their phones. You know, they're into their electronics, their iPads, and so it's I worry that now a lot of children who I grew up reading. I used to love to read Eric Ambler books, and Eric Ambler books were kind of like the James Bond spy movies. Yeah. They were not movies, but books, obviously. And I used to immerse myself in those. It's tougher these days, I think, to get today's youth to delve into the books, like you said. And I wonder how that's going to translate later. You know what I mean? And to be frank, reading it on a computer is not the same as the palpability of having the page in your hand. It's just not.
There's always that possibility that you can get distracted with a computer. I mean, it's very hard to write a book if you have access to a computer, let alone settle down to read one. And I think that one of the things that I'm very glad was possible when I was a child is that I was bored a lot of the time. And when you're bored, you find something to do. But if there's no possibility of ever being bored, how are you going to find that? I suppose the solution is, I don't know, lock kids in rooms without computers. But I'm not a parent, so I don't know whether that's a viable suggestion.
So, Jessica, we are going to go to a quick break, and then we want to come back and talk a little bit more about your book, some of your influences, ghostwriting, all that fun stuff. Can you stick around?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll be right back with Jessica Moor.